joke. Cannibal Corpse is the best death metal band. Asphyx is boring.
Pretty good joke, huh? I mean, imagine saying something like that seriously. Radio Free Intimate episode 289. This time around, we are going to be covering one of the most important bands for modern black metal. That being, of course, Catatonia.
You serious?
Well, I haven't legally changed my name to that yet. But yes, you heard me right. Catatonia, incredibly important for modern black metal, particularly the atmospheric black metal stuff and specifically the depressive black metal stuff. As far as that subgenre goes, they might be the most important band for that type of music apart from Burzum.
Autism.
Now, before anybody starts going crazy, I'm specifically talking about Catatonia in the early to mid 90s here, not the later stuff. But even then, people out there might be thinking, what about Bethlehem? What about Silencer? And yeah, those were two early examples of depressive black metal. But how many bands can you think of in that subgenre today that specifically sound like either of those outside of bands like Shining, who are clearly attempting to imitate that sort of thing? Whereas you can't walk outside in the Pacific Northwest without tripping over a band that's slamming together Burzum and Catatonia riffs while singing about acorns and feminism.
And I got news for you. That means you're gay.
Alright, but seriously, depressive black metal isn't really one of my favorite subgenres. I do enjoy a fair amount of the bands that influenced it, you know, like Burzum, Forgotten Woods, Strid, Bethlehem, and such. But even a lot of the older depressive black metal bands like Silencer or Abyssic Hate, they're okay, but they don't really do much for me. Life's already fucking depressing enough, dude. I think you could see that with the modern black metal that I do enjoy. Wagner, Odegaard, Raven Dark's Monarchal Canonical, Malefice, Turhey, that kind of thing. Definitely not about to put on some happy days, if you know what I'm saying.
Things that are meant to be broken can never be fixed. The more time you waste, the more it hurts.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that?
I mean, you can't really blame Catatonia for the lamentable excesses of the depressive black metal movement. If you go back to their 1996 album that was most influential to the genre, Brave Murder Day, it seemed like a pretty potent new dawn for a whole new style of metal. I mean, you had these really thick layers of highly ambient guitars constantly phasing in and out of each other, but they weren't abrasive in the same way that Burzum was. There still was a bit of dissonance to some of the chord selections, but overall it's giving off more of a bittersweet effect than the downright hostility you might get from the heavier moments of Vivis Licet Taros, etc. It's almost right at the line of what you could still conceivably call a metal riff and not a shoegaze wasp of noise. And in fact, the Catatonia fellas were pretty instrumental in establishing a lot of post-black metal conventions. Again, a genre I don't really like at all, but I don't blame Catatonia for it. They can't help it if other people ripped them off and took it in a shitty direction. You might also recognize the vocalist on this album if you are of a similar generational cohort as myself. That's the guy from Opeth. You know, that band that was your favorite band in the world for maybe 6 months, then you kind of got out of them and now you hate them? Yeah, that's the Opeth guy. Can't say I've ever fully gotten back into Opeth after getting out of them, but he does a good job on this album. The vocals have a bit more heaviness to them than standard depressive black metal fare nowadays. A lot of times these guys get lumped in with My Dying Bride, Anathema, Paradise Lost and such, and while they're definitely influenced by those bands, specifically Paradise Lost Gothic album, they've mentioned that in interviews. I don't know, man, I always felt way more black metal coming from these guys than standard sort of death doom stuff. Especially on this album, it's way too repetitive and ambient to even be considered death metal adjacent in my estimation. That said, despite its very ambient nature, it never gets boring, at least for me, and that's mostly because they mix in a whole lot of interesting stuff into this weird ambient gumbo. Like this bit right here, they're definitely still working in that shoegaze mold, but how many shoegaze bands you heard work in this kind of tapping stuff, using a shred guitar technique in a very ambient sort of context? I wish a lot of the bands that were influenced by Catatonia picked up on this aspect of their sound, their fondness for including unorthodox techniques. Big Opeth guy scream. That'll put some fucking hair on your chest. Like I said, I'm not the biggest Opeth fan, but he does a damn good job on this album. Gotta give him that. Fits perfectly with the sort of odd mix of anguish and nonplussed detachment in the wake of despair that this album exudes. And we're still rocking that tapping. Bet you Eddie Van Halen never would have believed somebody would use this technique to do some straight up Burzum style shit.
Excellent!
Another very noticeable aspect of Catatonia's music from this time is that these long songs are always kind of segmented off into different complementary movements. Like this part right here definitely could have become the germ of a whole new song entirely, but at the same time it still fits in with everything that came before it. Each song kind of has like 4 or 5 different sectioned off parts that sort of flow into each other. That old Austrian black metal band Abigor did a similar thing around the same time, but in a very different style of black metal.
어플로 주문하던가?
Yeah, we have been talking about black metal a lot this episode. Most people's understanding of Catatonia is that they're basically the Swedish version of Anathema. They started out playing Death Doom and then turned into Radiohead. What's the deal with that anyways? Well, to figure that out, we gotta move forward a little bit in their discography to the EP that came out right after Brave Murder Day, Sounds of Decay. This EP at points definitely leans a little bit harder into them being a Death Doom band. Like this really long lead guitar line here with those heavy chords under it almost sounds like something you might hear on a Gourmet demo. But once that more shoegazy proto-post-black metal thing starts kicking in, as Jonas's drums get a bit more mechanistic sounding and the guitars start to get a bit more ambient, you could definitely tell that this is a pretty logical follow-up to Brave Murder Day. In fact, from what I've heard, a lot of these songs were written during the Brave Murder Day sessions. I'm wondering if they just sectioned them off from the album because they did have a little bit more death metal to them than the weird shoegaze black metal thing they had going on Brave Murder Day. I mean, you've got completely the same lineup from that album, including the guest session vocals from Mr. Mikhail Okerfeld of Opeth. And despite this album being a bit more heavy and immediate than Brave Murder Day, it still works very much within that ambient sort of paradigm. And like that album, it uses some rather non-traditional elements in that sort of ambient context, such as this section right here using some very minimalist percussive guitar stings over top of a more jangly sort of goth rock lead guitar, before then varying up the drum beat with a more sort of death doom sounding section. So this begs the question, like, what happened to Catatonia? Why do they sound the way that they do nowadays? Because they pretty much stopped being a metal band after this EP. Well, the interesting thing about later Catatonia is you can hear elements of that old metal Catatonia sound. For instance, Brave Murder Day, you got plenty of riffs like that you heard earlier. If you go into later non-metal Catatonia, you can still hear parts like that come up. Like, yeah, maybe it's a little more jangly indie folk sounding, but in essence, it's a very similar riff. But then they jump off into stuff that definitely isn't even the postest of posty black metal or the shoegaziest of shoegaze black metal. This is just straight up alt rock or whatever. On Sounds of Decay, you had parts that went like this. That's from the same song you heard earlier. And if you go really late into Catatonia's career, you'll hear them sort of bring that style back in on occasion. Like maybe it's a little bit more modern and djenty, but it's similar enough. But then, like with that Brave Murder Day style riff, it transitions into a much softer sort of sound. What's interesting about this is Catatonia always kind of had those softer sort of sections, but in their old metal material, they were mostly used as quick transitions between different heavy musical movements. Nowadays, the heavy sections are used as transitions between big blocks of softer stuff. They've sort of flipped everything on its head. So they're not really a metal band anymore, but they're still a continuation of older Catatonia in a way, just not a black metal one. If you want to get back to the roots of Catatonia being a black metal band, you got to go back even further than Brave Murder Day. We're going in the other direction, back to the very underrated For Funerals to Come EP. This one's pretty wacky because it's kind of the least listened to of the classic Catatonia releases, but it's also probably the most black metal sounding. On vocals, we no longer have Opeth Man. Instead, we have the drummer, Jonas Renske, who blew his fucking throat out after this album and relegated himself to just clean vocals and drum henceforth. Blackheim's lead guitar was also probably its most technical on this EP. Anyways, here's a very black metal sort of riff. If it wasn't for the overlaid harmony guitar, this could almost be a Master's Hammer riff, just way happier. And that's the other interesting thing about Catatonia is despite being a big influence on depressive black metal, they weren't always that sad sounding. In fact, they get downright triumphant.
Excellent!
Particularly when Blackheim really starts letting loose on the lead guitar. Honestly, it's a damn shame more people don't talk about For Funerals to Come, because this is definitely one of the best Catatonia releases, at least to my ears. This part right here, kind of down-tempo, but again, not necessarily sorrowful, and it's building up to one of the most surprising moments in Catatonia's discography. Pretty much a total Argus-lent riff. Or that's what it sounds like to me, at least. In my defense, one of the few bands out there that gets compared to Argus Lent, Ares Kingdom, the main guy in that band actually had a side project called Vulpecula that sounded very similar to this era of Catatonia. Just a weird little aside. Speaking of weird asides, this fucking crushing black metal riff out of nowhere. Alright, they're straight up doing some of that Judas Iscariot, Dark Throne, Celtic Frost style, nasty, crushing, ultra primitive black metal breakdown stuff. See, I told you Catatonia were black metal. Not just black metal, multiple styles of it even. And watch where they take this riff. Check this shit out right here. One small variance in guitar technique. Palm mute that shit, turns it into a fucking slam death riff. What? Fucking bizarre, man. Yeah, get that shit out of here quick. Go back into the ambient stuff.
You are all weirdos.
Going into a section that wouldn't sound that out of place on a newer Catatonia album. See what I mean? They've always had sections like this. They just flipped the heavy sections and the light sections in terms of what's prominent in their later music. Also, the lighter sections in older Catatonia tend to be a bit more like 80s prog rock and new wave sounding and less 90s alt rock. Probably because they were hanging out with Dan Svano a lot back then. He even did a shitload of guest keyboards for him. You know what? Fuck it.
We'll do it live! Fuck it!
We're already going back in time. Might as well keep going that direction to the first Catatonia album, Dance of December Souls. Now this one's the Death Doom one, albeit it does have quite a bit of black metal to it. And at this point in time, melodic black metal and melodic death metal in Sweden were kind of existing within the same space. Quite a few people back then and today consider the first Dissection album to be more death metal than black metal. This kind of falls into the same gray area. And it's a pretty interestingly constructed piece of work. Side A of the album is mostly shorter, catchier songs. But I mean, you know, they're still long, epic tracks. It's Catatonia. You could definitely see how Jonas would end up blowing his throat out later. He's not really using proper black metal screaming technique.
Open the fucking door. Open the fucking door.
He's just kind of going for it, and honestly, it sounds damn heavy. By far, this is the heaviest Catatonia release. But like I said, this first half of the album also rather catchy and compactly structured. I get this little sequence of melodic riffs stuck in my head all the fucking time. And it's got those goofy Dan Spano 80s prog rock pop whatever keyboards. Nice. Interesting combo with that ultra heavy snare drum sound. Holy shit, that thing's loud. Anyways, even at this early point in their history, they were already experimenting, doing weird shit on guitar. Like, check this thing.
The fuck is that?
I don't know, some Rush circa Power Windows era shit. But then they're back into black metal apocalypse with a very black metal, very, again, kind of Master's Hammer sounding sort of riff with that loose sort of da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da kind of strumming. Also somewhat comparable to some parts you might hear in the guitar playing in early Graveland, but I don't think these guys were into Graveland at all. Second half of the album, two giant fucking monstrous tracks. This was like the birth of them getting really crazy with having multiple movements per song. We're talking 13 minutes apiece, bitch.
Yeah, bruh.
We're talking big-ass, sorrowful-ass, doom metal-ass riffs arranged into very well-written couplets. Look at how these two bits bounce off each other. Nice little progression of that guitar harmony there. Everybody likes that. And, of course, we were talking about multiple movements to each song. This one, of course, being a nice sort of triumphant black metal riff that you know is going to hit hard because it had the 4 count on the cymbal. Again, utilizing that sort of Master's Hammer style stutter strum and some very nasty vocals from Mr. Renske. Again, you can hear him shredding his throat as they record. And how many fucking bands since Catatonia have had riffs almost exactly like this one? I'm telling you, these guys were massively influential on black metal. And right as I say that, they go back into the death doom. God damn it!
Son of a bitch!
Who edits these?
야 날씨 나를 완전 제대로 잡아.
Oh yeah, that's right. Anyways, here's another one of those song movement switch-up thingies I've been harping on. This time going into some more weird, softer stuff at the same time. Still kind of heavy. Again, mostly because that snare sound is out fucking rages. But also because the melodies themselves have a lot of weight to them, and you can hear them bringing in more and more guitar layers. You can tell where the song's going. I don't gotta play all 13 minutes of this monstrosity for you. Rest assured, it's great. First Catatonia album, spectacular. Well regarded by even the most elitist of metal circles to this day. Or at least it was last time I checked. I don't know, maybe people hate this album now.
Unless you want something, motherfucker, get the fuck off our street.
Oh, the language on you. You blow your father with that mouth?
The fuck you say to my sister?
You know, since we're already moving backwards, might as well go to the first Catatonia release, 1992 demo, Jiva Elohim Meth, which despite being this really old demo, is an incredibly polished release that pretty much shows off most of the aspects of Catatonia's sound as it would exist going forward, just in an even more sort of black metal-y context. Check it out, Palace of Frost. This one actually was covered by Zaster at one point, on a split with Leviathan. How's that for black metal street cred? And it even features embryonic forms of the sort of movement-based composition that would become very important for Catatonia in the ensuing years, as we journey from that very depressive opening into this much more hostile sounding section of music, sort of in between black thrash and black doom, before hitting a hard stop and pulling back the curtain on a very dark, atmospheric sort of black metal tremolo riff that eventually leads us back into the death doom material, with a melody very much in keeping with the catchier earlier half of Dance of December Souls. See what I mean? Like, all of Catatonia is encoded in their earliest release. Also gotta wonder if these guys were in communication with the Greek black metal underground at the time, because these keyboards are so goddamn Verathron Necromantia sounding, into another super cool transition that leads us into one of the cleverest bits of songwriting on the entire release. A very smartly done melodic response to the lead guitar line from the beginning of the song. See right there how it kind of like dovetails with where the song started, but expands on that whole melody? And yes, this melody definitely sounds like it was influenced by early Paradise Lost, which is never a bad thing because early Paradise Lost was awesome. But more than that, early Catatonia is awesome. Jiva Elohim Meth, Dance of December Souls, For Funerals to Come, Brave Murder Day, Sounds of Decay. Get all of those. Essential stuff. I don't care what people on the internet have been telling you about this band. Their later stuff, you know, do what you want. It's alright for what it is. Not really my style, but it ain't half bad. Hopefully you didn't think this episode was half bad. Sorry it's a little late. Good to be back. Thanks for listening and watching whatever you did. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Now get out of my face and don't come back until